The grand chamber of the Galactic Council Station gleamed with lights from 1,000 worlds. Ambassador Helen Carter stood before the assembled species, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. She had practiced this moment for months, rehearsing every word of humanity's petition for a permanent council seat. 30 years of service, 30 years of proving Earth's worth, and finally they would receive the recognition they deserved. Admiral Jack Morrison stood beside her, his military uniform pressed and perfect. The Admiral had commanded Earth's defense fleet through countless peacekeeping missions for the Council. He had saved Vrexian colonies from pirate raids, escorted Threnari supply ships through dangerous space, and asked for nothing in return except friendship. His ships had shed blood for species who now sat in judgment of humanity. On Helen's other side, Chief Diplomat Lisa Bennett reviewed the datapad one last time. The numbers were impressive. Human medical teams had saved 14 million lives across the galaxy. Human engineers had built infrastructure on 47 worlds. Human negotiators had prevented 3 wars between Council species. The evidence was clear and undeniable. The Council chamber fell silent as High Counselor Zethrak of the Vrexian Empire rose from his seat. The Vrexian was massive, nearly 8 feet tall with scaled skin that gleamed like polished bronze. His species had dominated galactic politics for 2,000 years, and he carried that authority in every movement. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the chamber with the weight of ancient power. Helen expected formalities, perhaps some ceremonial speeches before the vote. Instead, Zethrak's words hit her like physical blows. There would be no vote on humanity's petition today. The Council had discussed Earth's request and found humanity lacking in certain areas. Before they could be considered for membership, certain conditions must be met. The first condition made Admiral Morrison's jaw clench. Humanity must surrender 60% of its military vessels to Council control. These ships would be used for galactic peacekeeping under Council command. Earth would retain operational control of only 40% of its fleet, barely enough to defend its own territory. The Admiral had built that fleet from nothing, trained those crews, and now the Council wanted to take them away. The second condition was worse. 5 of humanity's colony worlds must be relocated to make room for Vrexian expansion. The colonies in question were home to over 30 million humans who had spent generations building new lives. They would have to abandon everything and start over elsewhere. Zethrak didn't explain why Vrexian expansion was more important than human homes. He simply stated it as fact. The third condition felt like an insult wrapped in bureaucracy. All human technological development must be submitted to Council oversight before implementation. Every new engine design, every medical breakthrough, every advance in agriculture would need Council approval. The stated reason was safety, ensuring that young species like humanity didn't accidentally create dangerous technologies. The real reason was control. Helen listened to each condition with growing disbelief. These weren't negotiation points. They weren't areas for discussion. Zethrak presented them as requirements, as the price humanity must pay for the privilege of being considered equals. She looked around the chamber, hoping to see support from species humanity had helped. Instead, she saw only agreement or carefully neutral expressions. The Threnari representative, Ambassador Quellis, sat with his eyes downcast. 3 years ago, Helen had worked around the clock to save his colony from the Crimson Plague. Human doctors had risked infection to develop a cure. Over 2 million Threnari owed their lives to humanity's intervention. Now Quellis couldn't even meet her eyes as the Council demanded Earth's surrender. The Jeluvian delegation actually voiced support for Zethrak's proposal. Their infrastructure had been failing when human engineers arrived to help. Paul Grant and his construction crews had spent 18 months rebuilding their cities, asking only for friendship in return. Now the Jeluvians nodded along as the Council dictated terms that would reduce humanity to a subordinate species. Lisa leaned close to Helen and whispered urgently. They could request time to consider the terms, take the proposal back to Earth for discussion. Maybe there was room for negotiation, some way to modify the conditions into something less degrading. But Helen could read the room. This wasn't about negotiation. The Council had decided that humanity's eagerness for acceptance was weakness, and they were testing how far they could push. Admiral Morrison's hand moved to the communication device at his belt. Back in human space, the defense fleet waited for orders. He had always known this moment might come, despite Helen's optimism. The Council saw humanity as children playing at civilization, useful servants but never equals. They had mistaken patience for fear and generosity for desperation. Helen took a slow breath and centered herself. 30 years of her life had been devoted to this dream of humanity, taking its place among the stars as a respected member of the galactic community. She had believed in cooperation, in proving through actions that Earth deserved a seat at the table. Now she understood that no amount of proof would ever be enough for species who had already decided humans were lesser beings. When Helen finally spoke, her voice was calm and clear. She thanked High Counselor Zethrak for making the Council's position so very clear. There was no anger in her tone, no accusation, just simple acknowledgement of reality. Then she stated humanity's response with the same matter-of-fact delivery. Earth would not be accepting the Council's conditions. Humanity rejected the demand to surrender its military vessels, rejected the demand to relocate its colonies, and rejected the demand to submit its technological development to outside control. These terms were not the basis for partnership between equals. They were demands for submission from conquerors to conquered. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Several species had never heard anyone refuse a council directive so directly. Zethrak's expression darkened with anger, his scales seeming to darken with his mood. He began to speak about consequences and humanity's grave mistake, but Helen wasn't finished. She continued with quiet dignity. Since the council had made its position clear, humanity would make its position equally clear. All human personnel would be withdrawn from council space immediately. The medical missions would end. The engineering projects would stop. The peacekeeping patrols would cease. The trade agreements would be terminated. Earth would no longer participate in any council activities or initiatives. Lisa's eyes widened in shock. They hadn't discussed this level of response. But Admiral Morrison nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. He understood what Helen was doing. She was calling their bluff, showing them exactly what they were losing by treating humanity with such contempt. Helen addressed specific species by name. She looked at Ambassador Quellis and mentioned the Crimson Plague, the lives saved, the friendship offered. She looked at the Jaluvian delegation and spoke of rebuilt cities and restored hope. She mentioned a dozen other instances where humanity had helped without being asked, had given without expecting return, and now they knew what the council thought that generosity was worth. The council would need to find someone else to do the work they had taken for granted. Some other species would need to maintain the trade routes that human logistics experts had optimized. Someone else would need to mediate the border disputes that human negotiators had peacefully resolved. Someone else would need to staff the research stations where humans and aliens had worked side by side toward common goals. Zethrak tried to salvage his authority by declaring that humanity would regret this decision. He spoke of sanctions and isolation, of the consequences of defying the Council's will. But his words rang hollow even to his own delegation. The Council's power rested on cooperation and mutual benefit. Humanity was walking away from both, and everyone in the chamber knew that the Council needed Earth far more than Earth needed the Council. Helen ended her speech with simple dignity. Humanity had come to the Council seeking friendship and partnership. They had been met with demands for submission and surrender. The choice before them was clear: bow and be servants or stand and be free. Humanity chose to stand. She turned and walked from the chamber, her back straight and her head high. Admiral Morrison and Lisa followed, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Behind them, the council erupted into arguments and accusations. Species blamed each other for pushing too hard, for miscalculating humanity's response, but the damage was done. As they boarded the shuttle back to the human diplomatic ship, Lisa finally found her voice. She asked Helen if she understood what she had just done, the bridges she had burned. Helen looked out at the stars and replied simply, "Those bridges had been burned the moment Zethrak made his demands." She had just acknowledged the fire. Admiral Morrison contacted Fleet Command with new orders. All human vessels were to withdraw from Council space immediately. They were coming home, and this time they wouldn't be coming back. The age of humanity seeking the Council's approval was over. A new age was beginning, one where Earth would stand alone rather than kneel together with those who saw them as lesser beings. Captain Ryan Foster was 3 days into a supply run when the orders came through. His ship, the Vanguard, carried medical supplies, construction equipment, and food synthesizers, bound for a Threnari outpost on the edge of Council space. The cargo hold was full of equipment that would help the colony expand and thrive. Ryan had made this run dozens of times. each trip another small gesture of human goodwill. The communication from Fleet Command was brief and absolute. All human vessels were to cease current operations immediately and return to Earth space. No exceptions, no delays. Ryan read the message 3 times, trying to understand what could prompt such drastic orders. Then the follow-up arrived with the full explanation and everything made sense. He called his crew together in the common room. 40 people looked at him with confused expressions, wondering why they had suddenly changed course. Ryan explained what had happened at the council, how humanity's petition had been met with demands for surrender. He watched their faces change from confusion to anger to grim satisfaction. They had all felt the condescension from council species, the subtle ways they were treated as useful servants rather than equals. His chief engineer, Karen White, spoke first. She had spent 6 months training Threnari technicians to maintain their power systems. Every day she had dealt with their assumptions that humans were clever mechanics but not real scientists. The Threnari had been happy to accept her expertise but never her equality. Now they would see how well their systems ran without human help. Ryan gave the order to change course. The Vanguard turned away from the Threnari outpost, leaving them with half a delivery and no explanation. The colony would be confused, then concerned, then desperate as they realized no more help was coming. But that was no longer humanity's problem. The Threnari had sat silent while the Council demanded Earth subjugation. Now they could face the consequences. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out on hundreds of human vessels. Medical ships abandoned research stations. Transport ships turned away from trade routes. Engineering crews packed up their tools and left construction sites half-finished. The humans simply disappeared, leaving behind gaps that the Council species had never realized existed. Dr. Lisa Bennett ran a research facility on Council Border Station Gamma 7. Her team of 23 scientists worked on cross-species diseases, developing treatments that could save lives across multiple biological systems. The work was important and fulfilling, but when the recall order came, Lisa didn't hesitate. She ordered her team to pack only personal items and essential research. Everything else, all the equipment Earth had provided and the breakthroughs they had achieved, stayed behind with access codes deleted. The station commander, a Jaluvian named Korthas, tried to stop them. He argued that their work was too important to abandon, that millions of lives depended on their research. Lisa looked at him with cold eyes and asked where his voice had been when the Council demanded humanity's surrender. Korthas had no answer. He had been too comfortable with the status quo to risk defending his human colleagues. Engineer Paul Grant supervised construction on 6 different worlds. His crews built hospitals, schools, water treatment plants, and power stations. They worked long hours in difficult conditions because they believed they were building bridges between humanity and the galaxy. When the recall came, Paul sent the same message to all his teams. Pack up and come home. On Jaluvian Prime, his crew abandoned a hospital that was 70% complete. The Jaluvians had promised it would serve both their people and visiting humans, a symbol of cooperation. Now it stood as a symbol of what the Council had thrown away. The specialized construction equipment was human-designed, the techniques were human-developed, and the expertise to finish the job was boarding shuttles back to Earth. The impact was immediate and devastating. The Quellian mining colony on Tarsus 7 sent increasingly frantic messages as their excavation equipment broke down. The machines were human-made, designed to work in the colony's harsh environment. Without human technicians, the repairs were impossible. The colony's entire economy depended on mining operations that were grinding to a halt. The Vrexian medical facilities on 3 worlds faced a viral outbreak. The disease was minor, easily treatable with the protocols that human doctors had developed 5 years earlier. But those protocols required drugs synthesized using human-designed equipment and administered according to procedures that Vrexian doctors had never bothered to fully learn. They had always just called the human medical teams when problems arose. Now there were no human teams to call. The Jaluvian trade routes began to collapse within a week. Human logistics coordinators had optimized the shipping lanes, reducing travel time by 30% and cutting costs by even more. They had done it as a favor, helping a species that claimed to value human friendship. The Jaluvians had accepted the help and then supported the Council's demands. Now their carefully optimized system fell apart as ships collided, schedules failed, and cargo piled up in the wrong locations. Back on Earth, President Daniel Hayes addressed a unified planetary government. The vast assembly chamber in New Geneva held representatives from every nation and colony. For the first time in decades, there was no debate, no argument, no political division. Humanity spoke with one voice, and that voice said enough. The president's speech was broadcast across human space and picked up by council monitoring stations. He spoke calmly about 30 years of trying to earn respect from species who had already decided humans were inferior. He listed the lives saved, the infrastructure built, the wars prevented. Then he listed the council's response: demands for military surrender, forced relocation of colonies, and technological submission. President Hayes announced the Renewal Initiative. Earth would focus on its own people and its own future. The resources that had flowed out to help council species would now stay in human space. The scientists who had worked on cross-species problems would work on human advancement. The engineers who had built alien cities would build human colonies. The ships that had protected council trade would protect human interests. The reaction across human space was overwhelming support. Colony worlds that had struggled with limited resources while Earth sent help to aliens now saw investment flowing their way. Research facilities that had been asked to share every breakthrough with the council could now develop technologies without oversight. Young people who had been told to respect the ancient wisdom of council species started questioning why age should command respect that actions had not earned. Admiral Jack Morrison worked from Fleet Command on Luna, Earth's moon. Before him stretched holographic displays showing the position of every human vessel in the galaxy. He watched them all turn toward home, a massive convergence of ships that represented 30 years of patient fleet building. But these displays showed only part of the truth. The Admiral opened classified files that few people even knew existed. For 30 years, while humanity had maintained a modest public fleet, they had also been building in secret. Hidden shipyards in the asteroid belt beyond Mars, construction facilities in the outer colonies, research stations developing weapons and shields that the Council had declared too dangerous for humanity to possess. The 60 ships the Council had demanded represented less than 20% of Earth's actual military capability. The rest had been built quietly, away from Council monitoring by a species that had learned to smile and bow while keeping one hand on their weapons. Admiral Morrison had spent his career preparing for the possibility that diplomacy would fail. Now he would show the galaxy what humanity had really been building. He sent orders to the hidden facilities. The time for secrecy was over. Bring the ships out where Council sensors could see them. Let every species that had nodded along with humanity's humiliation understand exactly what they had tried to subjugate. Let the Vrexians who had demanded Earth's surrender see what they would have faced if humanity had chosen war instead of withdrawal. Captain Ryan Foster and the Vanguard crossed back into human space 3 weeks after leaving the Council station. What he found amazed him. The defensive perimeter had been reinforced with weapons platforms he had never seen before. New ships patrolled the borders, sleek and deadly designs that looked nothing like the vessels he had served on. Automated defense stations bristled with weapons that made Council technology look primitive. He docked at the orbital station above Nova Terra, humanity's largest colony world. The station had grown massively in just 3 weeks. Construction crews worked around the clock, building new docking bays and habitation modules. Ryan watched supply ships coming and going in a constant stream, all of them carrying goods between human worlds instead of to ungrateful aliens. In the station's common area, Ryan met other captains who had also returned from Council space. They traded stories of abandoned projects and confused aliens. A medical captain described leaving a research station where she had worked for 5 years. An engineering captain told of walking away from a half-built city. A transport captain had left a cargo of rare medicines sitting on a dock, turning away before the delivery was complete. None of them felt guilty. They all remembered the casual contempt 3 months after humanity's withdrawal, the Thranary colony on New Haven faced disaster. The agricultural systems that fed 3 million colonists had begun failing. Crops withered in fields that should have been thriving. Hydroponics facilities produced half their normal yield. Within weeks, the colony would face real hunger. Within months, famine. The agricultural systems had been designed by human scientists and maintained by human technicians. The Thranary had learned to operate them but never truly understood them. When problems arose beyond simple maintenance, they had always called for human help. Now there was no one to call. The humans were gone and their knowledge had gone with them. Ambassador Quellis sent desperate messages to the Council, begging for assistance. The response was bureaucratic delays and empty promises. Other species offered sympathy but little practical help. None of them had the expertise to repair human-designed systems. The Council had spent so long taking human help for granted that they had never developed equivalent skills themselves. Commander Alexis Ward was leading a routine patrol along the border of human space when her ship's sensors picked up a distress signal. The automated systems identified it as Threnari and prepared to ignore it per standing orders. But Alexis paused, her hand hovering over the console. She had friends who had worked on New Haven, people who had genuinely cared about the Threnari colonists. Against orders, she diverted her ship to investigate. What she found made her decision easy. A small transport vessel drifted in space, its engines failing and life support running low. Aboard were 200 Threnari civilians, mostly children, fleeing the growing famine on New Haven. They had pooled their resources to buy passage on an old ship, hoping to reach relatives in other colonies. Alexis brought them aboard her destroyer, the Resolute. Her crew worked to accommodate the unexpected passengers, converting cargo bays into temporary living spaces. The Threnari children stared at the human sailors with wide eyes, scared and confused. One little girl asked Alexis if the humans were angry at them. Alexis knelt down and told her that humans were angry at governments, not children. She delivered the refugees to Nova Terra and immediately faced consequences. Fleet Command demanded an explanation for her disobedience. She had violated direct orders by assisting Council species. Some officers called for her court-martial. Others, however, quietly supported her actions. The debate spread beyond the military and into the civilian government. Senator Greg Palmer led the faction demanding strict isolation. He argued passionately that humanity owed nothing to species who had betrayed them. The Threnari had sat silent while the Council demanded Earth's surrender. They had accepted human help for years while never offering genuine respect in return. Why should humanity save them from consequences of their own choices? But Ambassador Helen Carter argued just as passionately for a different approach. She reminded everyone that humanity's strength had never been in becoming as callous as the Council. Their strength was in being better, in showing what true civilization looked like. Helping refugees, especially children, wasn't weakness. It was proof that humanity's values meant something beyond political convenience. President Daniel Hayes made the difficult decision. Humanity would provide humanitarian aid where lives were at stake, but nothing more. They would not let children starve to punish governments. But neither would they solve the problems that Council species needed to solve themselves. Food and medicine would be provided to prevent immediate suffering. Technology and expertise would not be shared. The Council had wanted humanity to be subordinate. Now they could learn to be self-sufficient. The policy satisfied no one completely but worked in practice. Human ships delivered food supplies to struggling colonies, but refused to repair infrastructure or share technical knowledge. Refugees fleeing disasters were given shelter, but not granted access to human technology. It was a middle path between the extremes of vengeance and doormat diplomacy. The Council convened an emergency session to address the growing crisis. What they discovered was the depth of their own incompetence. For decades, they had relied on human expertise to solve problems and human innovation to drive progress. They had assumed this help would always be available, because young species like humanity were supposed to be grateful for Council membership. The economic data was devastating. 16 Council species reported significant trade disruptions. Medical facilities on 34 worlds faced supply shortages. Infrastructure projects on over 50 planets had stalled without human engineers. The carefully maintained peace between various Council factions was beginning to fray without human mediators to smooth over disputes. High Counselor Zethrak tried to blame humanity for the crisis. He proposed sanctions, even military action, to force Earth back to the negotiating table. But his words fell flat. Other species remembered that Zethrak's demands had caused this situation. The Vrexian arrogance that had assumed humanity would accept any terms now looked like foolish miscalculation. The Jeluvian delegate stood and spoke uncomfortable truths. Their economy was collapsing because they had become dependent on human logistics expertise. Their cities were failing because human engineers had maintained systems the Jeluvians had never fully understood. They had treated humans as skilled servants rather than true partners, and now they faced the consequences. The Quellian representative reported that their mining operations had dropped by 60%. Equipment designed by humans required human technicians to maintain. The Quellians had the manuals and the training, but they lacked the deep understanding that came from actually designing the systems. They could follow instructions for routine maintenance, but couldn't innovate solutions to unexpected problems. Smaller species began questioning whether the Council truly represented their interests. If the Council could demand humanity's surrender on a whim, what prevented them from making similar demands of other species? The Threnari delegate pointed out that his people had helped no one when the Council turned on Earth. Now Threnari colonies were starving, and the Council offered only sympathy. The session ended with no solutions and much finger-pointing. The Council's authority, built over thousands of years, was cracking under the weight of its own arrogance. Species that had once accepted Council directives without question now asked uncomfortable questions about who really benefited from Council policies. Meanwhile, in human space, the renewal initiative exceeded every projection. Nova Terra's population grew by 20% in 3 months, as colonists who had been waiting for Council-approved expansion permits decided to ignore alien bureaucracy. Mars hosted 3 new research facilities developing technologies that the Council had forbidden. The asteroid belt buzzed with mining operations that would have required Council environmental permits that took years to acquire. Earth's hidden shipyards moved into full production. The ships Admiral Morrison had been building in secret now emerged into public view. Destroyers with sleek designs and advanced weapon systems, cruisers mounting shields that could absorb damage that would cripple Council vessels, and rumors spoke of something larger. Massive ships being assembled beyond Neptune, vessels that would redefine what humanity could accomplish. Dr. Karen White worked in a laboratory on Mars that would have been impossible under Council oversight. The technology she developed pushed boundaries that the Council had declared too dangerous for young species. Advanced energy shields that could protect ships from weapons humanity wasn't supposed to possess. Propulsion systems that would let human ships travel faster and farther than Council regulations allowed. Every restriction that had held humanity back was revealed as artificial. Humans weren't too young or too inexperienced for advanced technology. The Council had simply wanted to keep them dependent and controllable. Free from those restrictions, human innovation exploded. Ideas that had been shelved for political reasons now received full funding and support. Captain Ryan Foster brought the Vanguard into Jupiter orbit and stared at what humanity had built in the shadow of the gas giant. Shipyards stretched for kilometers, construction frames holding vessels in various stages of completion. Some were replacements for the modest patrol ships Earth had always maintained. Others were something entirely new. Designs that incorporated 30 years of lessons learned from Council technology and then pushed far beyond it. A constructor ship pulled alongside the Vanguard. Ryan watched as automated systems upgraded his vessel with new weapons, improved shields, and more efficient engines. The work that would have taken months in a Council facility was completed in 3 days. Everything was human-designed, human-built, and human-operated. No permits required, no oversight needed, no permission sought. In the orbital station above Mars, Ambassador Helen Carter met with representatives from 3 species who had reached out through back channels. They were minor Council members, species without much political power but with long memories of human kindness. They apologized for their silence during the Council session. They explained that speaking out would have meant nothing and cost them everything. Helen listened without judgment. She understood political reality, but Captain Ryan Foster returned to human space after a supply run to the outer colonies and barely recognized it. 6 months ago, the border had been lightly defended, a symbolic presence more than a real military barrier. Now weapons platforms dotted the perimeter, automated defense systems that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously. Patrol ships moved in coordinated patterns that spoke of serious military planning. The Vanguard received clearance to proceed, and Ryan guided his ship past a destroyer he had never seen before. The vessel was sleek and dangerous-looking, with weapon ports that suggested firepower far beyond anything the Council navies possessed. The destroyer's hull bore the name Valiant and fresh paint that indicated recent completion. Ryan wondered how many more ships like it were being built in the shipyards he couldn't see. At Nova Terra Orbital Station, Ryan met with other transport captains for their regular briefing. The mood had changed dramatically from the uncertainty of 6 months ago. Everyone had seen the military buildup. Everyone knew that Admiral Morrison was preparing for something. The question was whether the Council would be foolish enough to test humanity's resolve. The answer came 3 days later when a science vessel, the Discovery, limped into Nova Terra with hull damage and 3 injured crew members. The ship had been conducting a survey in neutral space, work that was completely legal under galactic law. A Vrexian battle group had approached and demanded the humans leave immediately. When the Discovery's captain tried to explain they were in neutral territory, the Vrexians had opened fire. The Discovery's shields had held, a fact that shocked its captain. The ship was a civilian vessel with basic defensive systems, yet it had survived a military assault. The Vrexian weapons had been unable to penetrate human shield technology. The Discovery had escaped, but the message was clear. The Vrexians were done with diplomatic posturing and ready for violence. Admiral Jack Morrison convened an emergency meeting of his command staff on Luna. The holographic displays showed the location of every known Vrexian military asset near human space. There were more ships than expected, battle groups that had been quietly moving into position over the past month. High Counselor Zethrak was clearly planning something aggressive. The debate in the command center was intense but brief. Some officers advocated for a preemptive strike, hitting the Vrexian forces before they could coordinate an attack. Others argued for strengthening defenses and waiting for the Vrexians to make the first move. Admiral Morrison listened to all viewpoints before making his decision. Humanity would not fire the first shot in anger. They had withdrawn from the Council to avoid conflict, not to start a war. But neither would they accept being attacked without consequence. The next Vrexian vessel that crossed into human territory without authorization would be disabled and its crew detained. Not destroyed, not killed, but shown exactly what humanity was capable of when provoked. President Daniel Hayes addressed Earth and the colonies from his office in New Geneva. The speech was broadcast on all channels and picked up by Council monitoring stations. He spoke calmly about the attack on the Discovery and humanity's measured response. The Council, and particularly the Vrexian Empire, needed to understand that withdrawal was not weakness, and patience was not fear. The President made clear that humanity wanted no war. They had left Council space specifically to avoid conflict, but if conflict was brought to their borders, if human ships were attacked and human lives threatened, then humanity would defend itself with all available means. The Council had demanded 60% of Earth's fleet. Now they would see what that fleet could really do. High Counselor Zethrak responded with a speech full of bombast and threats. He called humanity ungrateful children who needed to be taught proper respect for their elders. He promised that Vrexian forces would teach Earth the consequences of defying the Council's will. The speech played well to Vrexian pride but sounded increasingly desperate to everyone else. Other Council species watched nervously as the Vrexians prepared for war. The Threnari delegate quietly contacted Earth's embassy, offering to mediate. Ambassador Helen Carter thanked them but declined. There was nothing to mediate. Humanity had withdrawn peacefully and wanted only to be left alone. If the Vrexians chose to attack anyway, that was a decision they would have to live with. In the shipyards beyond Neptune, the final pieces of humanity's greatest secret came together. The ships being built there were unlike anything the galaxy had seen. Dreadnoughts, massive vessels that combined firepower, speed, and defensive capabilities that would have seemed impossible under Council technological limitations. Admiral Morrison had spent 15 years developing them, waiting for the day humanity might need them. The first dreadnought, named Independence, underwent final systems checks. Captain Linda Shaw, chosen to command the massive vessel, walked through corridors that could house a crew of 800. The ship was a city in space, capable of operating independently for years if necessary. Its weapons could engage multiple targets simultaneously. Its shields could absorb damage that would vaporize a Council cruiser. And its existence had been completely hidden from Council intelligence. 3 weeks after the attack on the Discovery, a Vrexian battle group crossed into human territory. 6 ships moved in formation, heading directly toward Nova Terra's orbital station. They ignored repeated warnings to turn back, transmitted in multiple languages. When they were within weapons range of the station, they powered up their weapon systems and prepared to fire. Captain Linda Shaw brought the Valiant into position between the Vrexian ships in the station. Her destroyer was outnumbered 6-1, but she followed her orders with absolute confidence. The Vrexians, seeing only a single human ship, probably thought this would be easy. They were about to learn exactly how wrong that assumption was. The Vrexian commander sent a message demanding surrender. Captain Shaw responded by giving them one final chance to withdraw. The Vrexians answered by opening fire with everything they had. Plasma cannons, missile batteries, and energy weapons all targeted the Valiant in a coordinated attack that should have destroyed the destroyer in seconds. The Valiant's shields flared bright blue as they absorbed the incoming fire. Not a single shot penetrated. The Vrexians had built their weapons based on Council standard designs, systems that were thousands of years old and barely updated. Human shields were built on entirely new principles, designed from first principles without the weight of tradition or the restrictions of Council oversight. Before the Vrexians could fire again, the Valiant demonstrated what human weapons could do. Energy beams, blue-white and impossibly precise, struck each Vrexian ship in carefully calculated locations. Engine rooms were disabled with surgical precision. Weapon systems were neutralized without destroying entire sections. Communication arrays were left intact so the crews could call for help. In less than 3 minutes, the entire Vrexian battle group was adrift and helpless. Not a single Vrexian had died. Captain Shaw had followed her orders exactly. Disable, don't destroy. Show them what humanity could do. But don't give them martyrs or justification for escalation. The message was clear. Human mercy was not weakness, and human capability exceeded anything the Council had imagined. The combat footage was intercepted by monitoring stations across the galaxy. Within hours, every major species had seen what happened. A single human destroyer had defeated 6 Vrexian warships without taking damage. The Vrexians, who had built their reputation on military might, had been humiliated without humanity even deploying its main fleet. The Council met in emergency session, and this time the tone was very different from the confident demands of 6 months ago. Species that had supported the Vrexian position suddenly found reasons to distance themselves. The Jaluvian delegate openly questioned how the Council could have so badly misjudged human capabilities. The Quellian representative pointed out that humanity had been helping Council species for 30 years, while secretly developing technology that made Council weapons look primitive. High Counselor Zethrak tried to rally support for military action, but his authority was gone. The Vrexian Empire's reputation for military superiority had been destroyed in 3 minutes of combat. Other Vrexian officials began questioning whether Zethrak's policies had been wise. Some openly called for his removal, arguing that his arrogance had led the Empire into humiliation. Admiral Morrison watched from Fleet Command as Council forces began pulling back from human borders. The message had been received. Attacking humanity was not just dangerous, it was futile. Human defensive technology was superior. Human weapons were more effective. And this was just what humanity had been willing to show. The Admiral knew that full military deployment would reveal capabilities even more shocking. On Mars, Dr. Karen White watched the combat footage with professional interest. The shield technology was hers, developed over years of research that the Council had forbidden. The weapons systems had been designed by her colleagues, working on theories the Council had declared too dangerous. Everything that had made the Valiant invincible had come from human innovation, freed from Council restrictions. The news of the Vrexian defeat spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. On every Council world, on independent colonies, in trade stations and diplomatic outposts, beings watched the combat footage and tried to understand what they were seeing. A single human destroyer had disabled 6 Vrexian warships in 3 minutes without taking damage. The implications were staggering. High Counselor Zethrak tried to control the narrative, claiming the encounter had been a lucky strike against an unprepared force. But no one believed him. The footage showed careful precision, not luck. Every shot had hit exactly where intended. Every system disabled was chosen to neutralize the threat without causing casualties. This was not accident, but demonstration. Humanity showing exactly what they could do while still showing restraint. Within a week, Zethrak faced a vote of no confidence from his own people. The Vrexian Empire had built its power on military reputation. That reputation was now shattered, and someone had to take responsibility. Zethrak fought to keep his position, arguing that one battle meant nothing. But the other Vrexian leaders saw the larger truth. Humanity had been holding back for 30 years, and the Council had mistaken restraint for weakness. The new High Counselor, a Vrexian named Thorax, took office with a very different approach. His first act was to send a formal communication to Earth, not an apology exactly, but an acknowledgement that the Vrexian Empire had made errors in judgment regarding humanity. The aggressive posturing would stop. The ships would withdraw from human borders. The Empire would respect Earth's chosen isolation and hoped that future interactions might be more positive. President Daniel Hayes read the message and consulted with his advisors. Admiral Morrison recommended cautious acceptance, but continued vigilance. Ambassador Helen Carter suggested this was an opportunity to establish new principles for human interaction with the galaxy. President Hayes agreed and sent a response that would become the foundation of Earth's galactic policy. Humanity accepted the Vrexian withdrawal and appreciated the change in tone. Earth had no desire for ongoing conflict with any species, but going forward, relationships with humanity would be bilateral between equals, based on mutual respect and benefit. The Council could continue to exist and function as it wished, but Earth would not participate or acknowledge its authority. Individual species that wanted friendship with humanity could approach Earth directly. The message was simple but revolutionary. Humanity was not declaring war on the Council or trying to destroy it. They were simply opting out of its authority structure. The galaxy had operated under the assumption that the Council was the sole legitimate government for thousands of years. Now a species was demonstrating that this assumption was optional. The Council met to discuss this challenge to their authority, but the meeting revealed how hollow that authority had become. Smaller species openly questioned why they should enforce Council policies against humanity, when they themselves benefited from human trade and technology. The economic disruption from humanity's withdrawal had hurt the minor members far more than the major powers. Why should they make that situation worse? The Jeluvian delegate stood and spoke truths that others had been thinking but not saying. The Council had failed in its treatment of humanity. They had taken human help for granted, and then demanded human submission. Now they faced a galaxy where Council membership was no longer the only path to prosperity and power. The choice was simple: adapt to this new reality or become irrelevant. 3 species formally announced they were opening direct diplomatic relations with Earth, outside of Council framework. The Threnari, the Quellians, and the Mordaci all sent ambassadors to Nova Terra. They came not as supplicants seeking help, but as equals seeking friendship. Ambassador Helen Carter met with each of them personally and established the groundwork for what would become humanity's alliance network. The Threnari offered their agricultural worlds as trading partners. Human technology for Threnari food production, a simple exchange that benefited both species. Ambassador Quellis worked to ensure the terms were truly equal, with neither side taking advantage. He had learned from past mistakes and was determined to build something genuine. The Quellians proposed a mining partnership. Their worlds were rich in resources but lacked the advanced extraction technology humans possessed. In exchange for human equipment and expertise, they would provide raw materials at fair market prices and share any new mineral discoveries. The agreement included provisions for Quellian workers to learn human techniques, true knowledge transfer instead of dependency. The Mordaci, a species of brilliant engineers who had always chafed under Council restrictions, proposed collaborative research. They wanted to work with human scientists on projects the Council had forbidden: advanced energy systems, faster-than-light improvements, weapons technology that might never be built but should be understood. Dr. Karen White personally approved the partnership and assigned her best researchers to the joint projects. These bilateral agreements became templates for how humanity would interact with the galaxy. No hierarchies, no subordination, just partnerships between equals working toward mutual goals. Other species watched these relationships develop and reconsidered their own positions. The Council began to look less like the natural order of things and more like an outdated power structure, maintained by tradition and habit. On Mars, Dr. Karen White's laboratory hosted the first joint research team with Mordaci scientists. Working together, they achieved a breakthrough in shield harmonics that neither species could have reached alone. The humans brought innovative thinking unburdened by Council restrictions. The Mordaci brought centuries of engineering experience and mathematical precision. The result was technology that exceeded what either species possessed separately. Admiral Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of the Independence, humanity's first dreadnought, as the massive ship completed its maiden voyage. The vessel was everything he had hoped for and more. Fast enough to outrun most Council ships, tough enough to survive sustained combat, and powerful enough to engage multiple targets simultaneously, but he hoped it would never need to fire its weapons in anger. The Admiral had spent his career preparing for war while working for peace. He knew that strength was the foundation of real diplomacy. The Council had treated humanity with contempt when they thought Earth was weak. Now, knowing humanity was strong, they suddenly remembered how to be respectful. That lesson needed to be maintained. But Morrison also understood that military power was not the same as military aggression. The independence and ships like it existed to ensure humanity's safety, not to conquer neighbors. He had seen what happened to civilizations that believed military superiority justified domination. The Council itself was an example of that thinking, and the Council was crumbling. Captain Ryan Foster brought the Vanguard into Jupiter orbit for another upgrade. This time, the improvements included enhanced sensors and faster engines. Human merchant ships were becoming more capable than Council military vessels had been just a year ago. The line between civilian and military capability was blurring in ways that made traditional power calculations meaningless. He met with other transport captains at the orbital facility and found them discussing the new trade routes opening up with allied species. The Threnari routes were already profitable, moving food and technology in both directions. The Quellian routes were being established, with the first cargo of rare minerals expected to arrive next month. Talk was already beginning about routes to even more distant species who were interested in trading with humanity. One captain voiced what others were thinking. 6 months ago, they had been hauling supplies to ungrateful Council species who saw them as servants. Now they were building an independent trade network where humans were respected partners. The financial returns were better, but the psychological change was even more important. They were no longer trying to prove their worth. They were simply conducting business. Commander Alexis Ward received a new assignment that both excited and concerned her. She was to lead the Outreach Initiative, humanity's program for finding and working with species who shared their values. Not everyone in the galaxy was happy with Council authority. Not every species benefited from the existing power structure. Earth would offer them an alternative, but carefully and without trying to build an empire. Her first mission took her to a species called the Varen, who occupied 3 worlds on the edge of Council space. The Varen were known for their artistic abilities and philosophical traditions, but they had little military power. The Council largely ignored them except to demand taxes and tribute. Alexis approached them not with offers of protection but with offers of partnership. The Varen leadership was cautious at first. They had seen what happened when powerful species offered friendship. Usually it was the first step toward domination. But Alexis presented terms that were genuinely equal. Trade agreements with fair pricing. Cultural exchange programs. A mutual defense pact that required neither side to subordinate their military to the other. The Varen could remain independent while benefiting from human friendship. After 3 weeks of discussion, the Varen agreed to a trial partnership. They would trade their art and philosophical texts,